the Aboriginal peoples of Australia represent one of the oldest continuous human populations on Earth, with origins tracing back to the earliest migrations of modern humans out of Africa. Genetic and archaeological evidence show that their ancestors left Africa roughly 70,000 to maybe at the higher end 75,000 years ago, in what seems to be a single dispersal of humans across Asia. After departing Africa, these people followed the coast all the way down to the continent of Sahul, the prehistoric landmass uniting Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, when more water was locked up in glaciers, which lowers the sea level and exposes more land. And they made it all the way to Australia by at least 50,000 years ago. In the last video, we covered how reaching Sahul required open crossings, because even at the time of lower Ice Age sea levels, there remained gaps by the Wallace Line. I argue in that video that it was likely line-of-sight island hopping, because although it would require a ton of crossings today, the fact that you could do it today with the largest gaps being around 20 miles, the sea levels would have been a lot lower, these gaps would have been far shorter during the time of these migrations. But if we zoom in on this question of when the earliest people arrive in Australia, there's actually a ton of ongoing nuanced debate in academia. For much of the 20th century, the prevailing view was that Aboriginal Australians arrived around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, and this was based on a decent amount of archaeological finds. Human remains from sites like Lake Mungo in New South Wales, the Mungo Man and Mungo Lady, have been dated to about 42,000 years ago. But more recent discovery pushed back the likely arrival even further. Excavations at Majebebe, a rock shelter in the Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, have artifacts and layers dated to as early as 65,000 years ago. These finds included stone tools, ochre pigments, ground plant foods, and even the world's oldest polished axe heads. And this anchored the human presence in northern Australia by 60 to 65 millennia ago. Some researchers caution against that 65 KYA date, since items can shift in sandy sediment, preferring the more conservative 55 to 60 KYA, but even at that number, we're well beyond the 50,000 years ago hard limit from a couple decades ago. It's significantly earlier than the previous consensus. And of course, technology to understand our genome is getting better every year. So we have to reconcile the genetic evidence with the archaeological timeline. Modern Aboriginal Australians, like all non-African people besides the Basal Eurasians, they all carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. DNA that was acquired through interbreeding in Western Eurasia, thought to be around 50 to 45,000 years ago. This implies that the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians were still part of the main migrating human population at that time, that even they were of that main out-of-Africa migration movement. Everyone in that group, besides the Basal Eurasians, encounters Neanderthals in the Middle East and then spreads outward. But if a human group arrived in Australia as early as 65,000 years ago, that particular lineage may not be ancestral to the present populations, or may have mixed with the later incoming groups. It's possible that initial scouting groups reached Sahul on the earlier end of that range, with a much more substantial founding population arriving closer to 50 to 55,000 years ago. And some genetic studies argue that the successful colonization of Australia likely occurred after 50,000 years before present, which you can see comes full circle to that older point, which argued that people were populating Australia around 40,000 years ago. Maybe the people we're looking at today are of mostly that time, but they may not have been the very, very first. There were definitely some settlements here 65,000 years ago, and probably a ton more in that 25,000 year gap. If you saw my video on Homo sapiens were everywhere before out of Africa, I try and point out that both points are true. That there were modern humans just like us in Europe and throughout the Middle East and over into Asia from 210,000 years ago to 100,000 years ago, which when people first hear it, they think that contradicts the idea that populations all around the world come from the same out-of-Africa group which left around 70,000 years ago. But the big takeaway is that those earlier settlements died off. So likewise, some group definitely got to Australia 65,000 years ago, but they may have died off or were such a small population that when waves of settlers came around 50,000 years ago, it's this last wave of people that dominate and populate the entirety of Australia and Tasmania. Because we can really dial into their genome, and it's the only genome we see today. Now, two main migration routes have been proposed. a northern route from the islands of eastern Indonesia through what is now New Guinea, and a southern route from Timor across into northwestern Australia. I think the southern route is way more difficult. The island-hopping northern route is far more straightforward and safe, but even that would see them crossing tens of kilometers, like I said, on average around 20 miles, in between each of the many islands. By no means straightforward or a guaranteed success. You gotta imagine a lot of these guys are lost at sea. And we should keep in mind that the timing might have been influenced by the massive Toba volcanic eruption about 74,000 years ago, which has been speculatively linked to human movement, with some proposing that groups fleeing its aftermath could have arrived early, closer to 70,000 years ago. But that one would be harder to prove, but isn't that absurd. It's closer to being 65,000 years ago. But in any case, Australia's first people likely explored rapidly. Researchers using computational models and ecological data suggest that within a few millennia, the descendants of the initial arrivals had fanned out all across the continent's diverse habitats, reaching southern Australia and even the foothills of the Australian Alps by 45 to 50,000 years ago, and crossing the then land bridge into Tasmania around 40,000 years ago. Big picture here, keep in mind that humans went from East Africa all the way to Australia in maybe as little as 5,000 years. Which should make you think how reasonable it is to think that other hominids could have reached all over the Earth, especially during lower sea levels. But also that while that seems really fast to us, when you actually get into the numbers, that pace is pretty normal. The distance if they were mostly hugging the coast is about 15,000 kilometers or 9,320 miles. But that comes out to only 3 kilometers or 2 miles of expansion a year. I think that's pretty reasonable, just as the population grows and moves just a bit further than your parents, right outside the camp. Even if we drop it down to just a mile a year, that still gives them 10,000 years to get all the way to the land down under. It seems really fast because we're used to these old migration timelines, but it could have been as slow as 1 mile a year. It did make me think, why don't other primitive tribes do this today? Don't they all just seem to stay in their general area? And yes, and the mainstream explanation for this is that it's just rival tribes keeping everyone in their place. Like today, there is no new land to add to your homestead or to your country. Everything is claimed and has borders. So the idea is that these humans migrating around 70,000 years ago had more free range. I don't buy that fully, because everyone outside of Africa has some sort of Neanderthal or Denisovan admixture, and their tech level would have been similar to the conditions of some tribes in Africa or the Amazon, wielding fire and having spears. Were they really so much better at warfare than Neanderthals or Denisovans? Why didn't these other hominins keep us in check, keep us restricted to just Africa? Maybe it was just that food was far more easy to get, so that populations boomed, more viable pregnancies and kids living into adulthood, or I think it could just be what you call a cultural thing. Whatever caused them to leave Africa, either good conditions or a mindset, whatever that force was, it also kept them moving. Maybe it was political tension, issues with tribal elders, being pushed out, or an environmental trigger like Toba, or food scarcity. Whatever the reason, most people do not willingly leave their ancestral lands, especially not the most primitive of people, whose entire worldview is tied to the land, with spiritual ties and ancestors, all that sort of stuff. I think something made expansion the only option, and maybe whatever caused that sticks in their mind, sticks in their culture, and it just becomes natural for the next generation to expand out. It would definitely be advantageous, as it's never good to have all your eggs in one basket. Something made it so trying to make it in their ancestral lands wasn't cutting it. Whatever the cause for migrations, in about 10,000 years, humans came to occupy every corner of the Australian continent, from the tropical north to the arid interior and the temperate south. Being there so long ago, and then being isolated with the rising sea levels, it was the perfect combination to give rise to the extraordinarily rich and distinctive Aboriginal cultures, which would not be observed by outsiders until Europeans came tens of thousands of years later. So I'll get into their myths and their culture in a sec, but I want to keep drilling into their genome just to stress how unique it is. Like I said, there are some earlier sites that may have been unsuccessful waves of migrants into Australia, but genetic studies confirm that the people we see today are direct descendants of those people from at least 50,000 years ago. By then, they were genetically distinct from ancestors of Europeans, East Asians, and other Asians. And a crazy comparison is that European and East Asian lineages only diverged from each other about 40,000 years ago. So the Aboriginal and Papuan lineage is more ancient and distinct than what we think of as European people and East Asians. But another thing people are surprised by when they look into ancient genetics is that people groups really were able to stay distinct from each other. Even when Australia and New Guinea remained connected by land, all the way up until 8 to 10,000 years ago, Aboriginal Australians and Papuans became genetically distinct from each other far earlier. Their genetic divergence is estimated at 25 to 37,000 years ago, long before the physical separation of the continents. And so while there is this assumption that if people physically could easily get from one area to the other, they must have and likely intermixed with each other, but that just doesn't seem to be the case anywhere we've looked. And that shouldn't be that surprising. Think of the world of 1000 BC. You see trade and cultural impacts all across the old world. Items and ideas are going from China to Greece to Egypt to India, mixing everywhere in between. But does that mean there's no genetic difference between an Egyptian, an Indian, and a Chinese person? Even in times of vast trade networks, it isn't like it's one big melting pot. Same thing happening with the Australians and Papuans, and then also within Australia. By tens of thousands of years ago, Aboriginal Australians had differentiated into regional groups within Australia itself, living in relative isolation across the continent's different ecological zones. Somewhat like with Africa, within Australia, genetic studies show extraordinary diversity and longevity of lineages. Aboriginal communities today show strong genetic continuity with the same regions that their ancestors inhabited 30 to 40,000 years ago. People are impressed when this happens in Anatolia or England, when some guy living in that town is a direct descendant of someone maybe up to 10,000 years ago. But in Australia, we're seeing it up to 30 to 40,000 years ago, just about right up to the time of the successful migration wave. And this is why it's often said that they collectively represent the oldest continuous culture, with 2,000 generations in the same land. So to be fair with the mainstream point about borders, about tribes keeping each other in check, that they just expanded so far because no one was checking them, in defense of that theory, it does seem like even these people, who were some of the most successful adventurers, even they do coalesce into their tiny little areas, essentially once they hit the end of the map, to choosing not to mix with the people over in New Guinea, and not even mixing with people of other parts of Australia. Once people are everywhere, whoever was there seems to just stay in that same spot, at least up into the age of massive, powerful armies, produced by that combo of metallurgy and grain domestication, from the Romans to the English. Another thing unique about them is their relationship to archaic humans. Like I said, just about everyone outside of Africa has a small percentage, about 2% of Neanderthal DNA, but Aboriginals and Papuans can have about 4 to 5% Denisovan ancestry, which is the highest in the world. And so this seems to indicate that there was a large population of Denisovans in Southeast Asia, throughout Oceania. And to complicate it even more, new research thinks that this might not come from the so-called classic Denisovans known in Siberia, where we first got their genetic sequence, but instead from a distinct but related archaic species. I tried to see if they think it's Homo longi, but I wasn't finding anything definitive. But then, is Homo longi just Denisovan? These distinctions get very muddy. It was the major 2016 genomic study that found a, quote, uncharacterized ancient hominin in the Aboriginal gene pool. This was said to be a distant relative of Denisovans that modern humans likely met near Sahul. And I've even seen some speculation that it might be related to Homo erectus, or their descendants, the so-called hobbits or Homo floresiensis of Indonesia. It's worth noting that earlier anthropologists, looking at Aboriginals' physical features, once hypothesized that they might have descended from a different early human species or a separate migration. Like the robust skulls of some ancient Australian skeletons, like the cow swamp fossils around 10 to 13,000 years old, they were noted as having archaic-looking traits, with heavy brow ridges and flat foreheads. In the 1970s, some researchers even suggested that these features indicated, quote, the survival of Homo erectus characteristics in Australia until as recently as 10,000 years ago. But we now know that is not the case. These robust features are best explained by natural variation and maybe even cultural practices, like intentional cranial deformation. Genetically, they are definitely not a different species. They're not different from the humans all over the world today. If anything, there's actually a semi-decent argument for the out-of-Australia theory. That everything's just so early and unique here that maybe people came from Australia, not out of Africa. But I've gone down that rabbit hole and it doesn't work out. Maybe I'll make a video on it one day. So their distinct appearance is the result of tens of thousands of years of adaptation and genetic drift isolated here in Australia. And there's even quirks which match with things like Allen's rule for hot climates, that some Aboriginals, especially in the central deserts, are quite lean and lanky. And on the questions of it being multiple waves of migrations into Australia, the current consensus is that it was a single founding event. Remember, what makes that confusing is that there could have been people getting here around 65,000 years ago, but they could have died off. And there was even a relatively popular hypothesis that there was a migration from the Indian subcontinent around 4,000 years ago. A 2013 analysis by the Max Planck Institute found about 11% of some northern Aboriginal Australians' DNA appeared linked to Indian populations. And by looking at these percentages, it puts you back to the time around 4,000 years before present. And that actually matched up with certain changes in the Australian archeological record. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, we have new tool types, like microlithic stone tools that appear, and the wild dingo, a type of dog, is first seen in the fossil record at this time, along with evidence of new plant processing techniques. Put it all together, and it seems like some of these innovations were introduced by migrants from South Asia. But the more recent comprehensive genome projects from 2016 and on have changed this story. The large-scale Aboriginal genome study led by Willerslev did not find any evidence of substantial recent Indian or any other external migration to Australia. Instead, the major linguistic and cultural shifts around 4,000 years ago seem to be the cause of one specific group in Australia. They discovered trace of a people group from somewhere in northeastern Australia who spread across the continent about 4,000 years ago. Like I said, for the most part, they all stayed isolated in their own area, but for some reason, at this time and with these people, that was not the case. They spread across the continent, influencing the cultures of many different communities and altering their languages. But just as strange, they largely disappear from the genetic record. The smoking gun here is the language Pama-Nyungan, and some new tool technologies. Their genetic footprint is barely detectable, suggesting that they were few in number. Willerslev described it as a, quote, really weird scenario. A few newcomers arrive and, quote, change the way people speak and think, and then vanish, quote, like ghosts, with all these other different groups staying in their areas like before. So in other words, it wasn't a mass migration of these people from the northeast of Australia. It may have even started as a small-scale transmission of culture, maybe just intermarriage or influential individuals, i.e. a conqueror, either of the warfare nature or maybe in the way of a traveling preacher sort of thing. Like how it only takes a few Christian monks to so radically change the Irish culture. But however it happened, it resulted in 90% of Aboriginals speaking a language that seems only a few thousand years old, even though genetically those groups have been separated for tens of millennia. And so if you watch a bunch of my videos, I guess I will have to keep stressing this every time I see it, because apparently I need to. I guess I used to be surprised by this too, but I'm surprised at how many mainstream academics seem to be bamboozled by this when they see it. And similarly, they never seem to consider it as an option when looking at mysterious elements of other cultures. In the Takakori people video, the so-called Green Sahara genome, it was groundbreaking because we finally got DNA to work with, and it showed that they were a distinct people group, now called ancestral North Africans. Despite the Green Sahara making migrations across Central Africa far easier, an earlier study said that these people were likely a mix. When we got the full genome, it ended up being very different. They seem to have split from all other African groups around 50,000 years ago. It's described as being within what we call the out-of-Africa migrations, whatever caused this massive movement of people. But they don't actually leave Africa completely, they just go up north. Point is, these people would see a dramatic cultural change going from foraging to being pastoral, managing herds of animals that were domesticated in the Levant, Anatolia, and the Middle East. The paper that broke this news said that they were only, I stress, only about 7% admixture from the Levant. But I made the point that I think that is plenty. All over the world, from Turkey with cultural elements that originated from Arabia, or you could just look at how large the Roman Empire was. That doesn't mean all this red area on the map was now predominantly Roman genetics. but they changed many aspects of culture in these conquered lands, or to the Anglo-Saxons with the natives in Britain. It's actually the norm that culture changes with only around 10% genetic change. Invaders take over the powerful centers like a capital, fort, or castle, and so a minority changes culture without a complete genetic change of the common people. From mainland European invaders into England, or in Central Africa with the Bantu expansions, and apparently into Australia with these mysterious Aboriginal conquerors. Keep this in mind as we're going to start looking at how incredibly unique their culture is. You got to think that it's possible that with this odd unifying force of the Pama-Yungan people, they obviously erased some languages, and so likely some other local traditions. But I think even with that, you'll still see that we have a ton of things to work with. What remains truly shows how beautiful and unique human minds can be. I mentioned before that they're cited as the oldest continuous culture on Earth, and if you're wondering why that's not the San people of South Africa, I kind of agree, but I get that the point that they're making here is that the San are not as pure and isolated. In South Africa, their culture, tech, genome, and even where they live being restricted more and more over thousands of years, they have been affected by a ton of other groups, mostly the Bantu. But of course, the Australians are unique in that they're isolated, they got there so early, and while they do coalesce into different pockets, there are still unifying themes across all of them that we can describe broadly as Aboriginal culture. But before European contact, it was home to hundreds of distinct Aboriginal nations or tribes, each with its own territory and language. The estimates range from 500 to 600 tribes, and about 400 Aboriginal languages, 306 being of the Pama-Yungan language family. But just because they're in the family doesn't mean they're not distinct languages. Think of it like with the Indo-European language family, from Greek to English to Hindi. Maybe we get surprised at how some words are similar, but that's not enough to actually understand each other. We're in the same language family, but with a ton of distinct languages. But the fact that there are about 94 other non-Pama-Yungan languages shows just how mind-bogglingly diverse Australia was before and still is. Now, none of these societies had writing, but they did have elaborate oral traditions, an art unlike any other place on Earth. At the heart of Aboriginal culture is the rich spiritual framework often referred to as the dreaming or dream time. You might hear it called Chakurpa in some languages, but the dreaming is foundational of Aboriginal religion, cosmology, and even law. According to their beliefs, in the primordial time before time, the dream time, ancestral spirits emerged and traveled across the formless earth, creating the landscape, the plants and animals, and establishing the customs and laws for human society. Every rock, waterhole, and mountain was formed by these ancestral heroes, who often took the shape of giant animals or hybrid creatures. The ubiquity of this concept should strike you. Spirits going over the formless earth, hybrid animal creatures. It's a lot of the same ideas we're used to seeing in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece, with gods taking human and/or animal forms and being the architects behind specific aspects of reality, the god of something, creating and sustaining that thing. Many Aboriginal groups tell of the rainbow serpent, a powerful creator being that carved out rivers and valleys, or ancestral figures like the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades constellation, whose adventures are written in the stars. The dreaming is not considered mythology in a dismissive sense, but rather a living, ongoing reality, how we view history and physics. The totality of this worldview is described as the every-when, an ever-present realm that underpins the visible world. Don't worry, all of this will get its own complete video soon, as it's just too deep to be a subset of another video. I really do think it's one of the most unique and interesting concepts in all of human history, as I think it's ideas that are very similar to this that people find so profound when they see it in the form of the eternal now of Christianity, as future events are talked about as if they're happening now and were prophesized long ago. Hindu texts talk of being outside time, or seeing all realities as happening at the same time. And modern quantum physics just reminds us constantly that reality is not as straightforward as our experience of simple linear time. So expect a deep dive on dream time soon. But to understand it broadly, it provides a moral code and connects people intimately to the land. Each person is linked to certain dreaming stories and totems, often an animal or plant, which defines their kinship and responsibilities. Totemic ancestors are revered, and ceremonies, songs, and art serve to reenact the dreaming stories, and it all works to keep creation in balance. Where the deepest metaphysical truths, like the creation of time itself, to their actual historic ancestors, and how they should behave on a day-to-day basis, are all encompassed in these ideas. And it has remarkable continuity. Some stories and songlines, which are the sacred paths across the land, have been passed down for so many generations that they encode real events of the distant past. This even includes stories of rising sea levels and coastal flooding that corresponded to the end of the last ice age, so around 7,000 years ago. You may have heard that oral tradition is not as secure as people like to think, that people who romanticize it in pre-literate cultures or want to think that oral tradition preserves things perfectly for some religious reason. A lot of studies show that this is mostly false when it comes down to specifics, but not things like the core point or framework, or major details like a great flood or rising sea levels. Here with the Aboriginals, it actually lines up with the most accurate geographic surveys. As researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed report, Aboriginal stories from 21 coastal sites around Australia describe times when the sea level was significantly lower. One Aboriginal said, quote, "In the beginning, as far back as we remember, our home islands were not islands at all as they are today. They were part of a peninsula that jutted out from the mainland, and we roamed freely throughout the land without having to get in a boat like we do today. Then Gongur, the seagull woman, took her raft and dragged it back and forth across the neck of the peninsula, letting the sea pour in and making our homes into islands. This story is from an area where this happened around 8,000 years ago." And then we have, in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, some of the oldest and most odd, to outsiders at least, paintings of the so-called Gwion Gwion, formerly called Bradshaw figures. These delicate, elongated human forms, often painted in dark red hematite pigment, seem to float across the rock surfaces. Adorned with elaborate headdresses, sashes, and tassels, they show these thin human figures in these dynamic poses, running, dancing, or wielding boomerangs, sometimes surrounded by geometric patterns or dots, which may represent ceremonial energy or rain. Radiocarbon and uranium series dating place these works at least 12,000 years old, with some possibly extending back 17 to even 20,000 years ago. And their fine detail is extraordinary. Individual feathers, beads, and body paint are visible. It all suggests a highly developed ritual costume and performance traditions. Some Aboriginal elders describe these figures as spirits of the first people, and the paintings themselves are said to have been self-created by those ancestral beings, appearing on the rocks as their life essence seeped into the stone. That takes the old stone tape theory in ghost hunting, the idea that what you think of as a personality is a pattern in your mind, that in some way, the pattern of someone's life gets instilled into the material around them. Why you'll hear a ghost walking up the stairs. It's something they did numerous times every day for their entire life. So it's kind of that idea. The Aboriginals are saying that these first people, somehow their very spiritual essence has been imbued on these stones. It's like a photograph, an energy that's imprinted on a medium, and now we have these images to look at. It's really interesting to wonder if this has any connection to the idea that someone came here around 65,000 years ago, but those are not the direct descendants of the people from around 50,000 years ago. There were settlements here before the Aboriginals, so maybe that's why these are so unique. They're not of that main out of Africa dispersal. They're from the people that are even older, before what we think of as the Aboriginals. And so maybe as those earliest of settlements died out, they left behind some images, or their very small population was absorbed by this later wave of what we think of as Aboriginals, and that's why we don't see any genetic signature from them, but maybe their culture was preserved. If we're saying that the Aboriginal stories have stayed the same for so long, that they're correctly mapping on to rising sea levels after the Ice Age, maybe they've enshrined this memory of the very first people in Australia. That's just me speculating, so let me know what you think in the comments. But farther north, in the Arnhem Land, the rock shelters of the Kakadu and the Barunki region reveal a completely different but equally distinctive style known as X-ray art. Here, figures of fish, turtles, kangaroos, and humans are painted with internal organs visible, bones and viscera outlined with white pigment as though the viewer is seeing through their skin. These paintings, some over 8,000 years old, but many were renewed into the last few centuries. But they are not anatomical studies in a Western sense. They express the Aboriginal understanding that life is animated by inner spiritual power, called Mar. Depicting an animal's insides is a way of honoring and communicating with its spirit, acknowledging the reciprocity between hunter and prey. X-ray art also serves as a practical role, teaching younger generations which parts of the animal are edible and which are taboo. It's kind of a theme you'll see in all of my videos on ancient culture. I really love that there isn't this strict distinction between a mythological worldview and a practical worldview, whether we see it in Egypt or Australia. But elsewhere, like in the Quinconn County of Queensland's Cape York Peninsula, rock galleries are filled with dynamic scenes of human life. Hunters chasing wallabies, dancers in headdresses, spirits with exaggerated limbs, and clusters of hand stencils, red or white silhouettes made by blowing pigment around a hand that's pressed up against a rock. These hand stencils are among the most widespread motifs in Australian rock art, and to some groups it's like a roster or a census. Your hand on that rock means you're officially part of the group, marking one's identity, not being as individualistic as, say, a sculpture would be or your own portrait on the rock. The hands are all very similar, but you would know that that rock was your hand, and it showed your ancient connection to this spot. And because the entire phenomena of images appearing on rocks has been spiritualized, you are putting your hand on the threshold between the physical and the spiritual world. When hundreds of hands cluster together in narrow caves, it evokes the presence of entire clans reaching through time. Over hundreds and then thousands of years, when you put your rock up against those hands, in this framework of the every-when, everything exists at the same time, you are literally touching hands with your ancestors. And then in southern Australia and Tasmania, we again get a different style. Rock engravings rather than paintings dominate, carved into sandstone or basalt using pecking or abrasion. At sites like Murujaga or Ku-ring-gai Chase near Sydney, these petroglyphs show emus, kangaroos, whales, sharks, and human figures with upraised arms or elaborate headgear. Some carvings stretch several meters wide, etched over thousands of years as desert varnish accumulated. Murujaga in particular has one of the densest concentrations of petroglyphs in the world, estimated at more than 1 million images. Some could be more than 30,000 years old. The repetition of certain motifs, like the concentric circles and radiating lines, could be meant to evoke natural phenomena like water holes, stars, or the sun, but also ceremonial centers, which connected the land to the cosmos. And a key feature of Aboriginal art is its continuity through transformation. Each region developed new techniques and palettes as materials and meanings evolved, but the underlying cosmological principles remained constant. Again, we're impressed by Egypt and the Middle East more broadly, at how certain images, styles, and worldviews stay around for a few thousand years. This is tens of thousands of years. And maybe, again, my speculation, but since the traditions and meanings are kept alive by Aboriginals today, maybe it gives us insight into odd artistic choices in other parts of the world. In my leopard cult video, going over these odd figures in Anatolia, some people want to make it as simple as race, saying that because there's black figures, they probably just had black skin. But I made it very clear and kept trying to stress that there are characters that are half black, half red or yellow, split right down the middle. That this can't be literal, it has to be symbolic of something. It wasn't about the race of the people. The Aboriginals and humans all over the world are using ochre. And for them, red ochre symbolized life force and blood. Yellow and white were used for body decoration and sacred objects. But the black coloring doesn't have a specific meaning, it's just meant for contrast and to show depth. And it's funny how us moderns make such a fuss about preserving things, but whether we're talking about Europeans tearing down Roman structures, or here with this sacred artwork, just because they think it's sacred, that doesn't mean you can't paint over stuff. It's a living tradition. Some walls record tens of millennia of repainting, where generations renewed images of ancestral beings to keep their power active. If you weren't adding to something, that meant it was not alive. The act of repainting itself was ceremonial, re-inscribing the dreaming and linking living people to their ancestors. And again, people make such a fuss if their religious text happens to map onto some real event, but these rock paintings depict now extinct megafauna, giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, or the geniernis, a huge flightless bird. And these all vanished more than 40,000 years ago. And then you have sequences of paintings showing canoes and first contact scenes, like images with the moccasins sailing prowess, or even European ships, seamlessly incorporated into the sacred continuum of dreaming imagery. How beautiful is it that their everywhere dreamtime concept is true? You could look at this artwork with modern European ships and say, well, that's not ancient, but it's part of one continuous thing showing animals that are 40,000 years old. It's not just ancient, nor is it just modern. It's truly timeless. But now let's look at how their society was actually organized. Traditional Aboriginal societies were typically organized into small bands of extended families, which formed larger clans or tribes sharing language and customs. There was no centralized state or kingdom. Kinship in Aboriginal Australia was complex and goes far beyond the nuclear family. It's defined as one's relationship to everyone else in the tribe, and even to people of other tribes. And it all dictates obligations over who can marry whom, and who they have to avoid, and who's responsible for certain ceremonies. Many of these groups have section or subsection systems, which is a kind of social categorization that assigns each person to a named group, like so-called skin groups, that guided marriage alliances and totemic duties. The elders held authority as custodians of knowledge and lore, rather than being like little dictators. Decision-making was just communal and often taken by a consensus, though of course heavily guided by tradition. And so it is still the elders saying, wait, this new idea would go against our tradition. Come on guys, we really got to do it this way. But how do they remember all of these stories? Well, it's all encoded in songs and dance, that just like how a lot of our oldest texts have a rhyme scheme and are repetitive in a lot of areas, to the point that I get complaints that I keep repeating the same lines when I'm reading some of these texts, making audiobook versions of them. Some people really underestimate how, like the chorus of a song, these ancient texts have these long repeating segments in them. And so it can get kind of hard to listen to when you're just reading it like a book. But when these would have been acted out, it would have been a lot more entertaining when the words actually flowed better together and this was acted out. Similarly with the Aboriginals, the so-called songlines, or dreaming tracks, are songs that describe routes across the land and all the waterholes, landmarks, and resources along them. By learning the songline of a particular ancestor, one could navigate long distances and also understand the spiritual significance of each site. This was crucial for survival in the often harsh Australian environment. Knowledge of where to find water in the desert, when certain bush foods are available, or how to predict weather is embedded in their stories and songs. And there's evidence that some songlines span the entire continent, facilitating trade and communication between far-off groups. There's the example of high-quality stone for tools, ochre pigments, and ceremonial shells being traded along these networks. So like we see throughout all time, all over the world, remember these people all came in one wave, but do coalesce into different people groups within Australia, but they still have far-off trade networks, which is surprising when we're talking about the pygmies in Central Africa or across the harsh terrain of Australia. But they did maintain continental networks of exchange and ceremonial gatherings, while all sharing what we would describe today as a religious framework. In medieval Europe, they're all Christian, but you better believe, and all the wars attest to the idea, that all the different people groups of Europe saw themselves as very distinct, even with trade flowing across every border and having the same metaphysical worldview. And another interesting point about songlines I want to just put in here is that it's very similar to points people make about Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad. It works as both a map, as it describes real places with enough detail that you could sail to them and you could understand the geography, down to their metaphysical views on how the gods work, what pleases them, what offends them, how to maintain the rituals of their people, and moral lessons, what do these people think are good or bad actions. There were also originally oral traditions, direct contact transmission in group settings, where all you have to do is hear the story, and you're getting details on things as profound as the gods, to how to properly sail a ship, and even cook certain meals. Again, what's just so fascinating to me is how unique these things take their different forms across the world, but it's all so utterly human. Everyone is doing the same type of thing. And if we look to their views on land management and what technology they had, they are usually classified as hunter-gatherers, but they do practice innovative forms of land management that blur the line between foraging and farming. They are masters at the principle of fire stick farming, the regular, controlled burning of underbrush to manage the landscape. And can we pause here and just appreciate how funny that term is? Fire stick farming. It sounds a lot better than saying we just burn down the forest so regularly that it never builds up. And it ends up actually being good. It's also just the laziest way to hunt, burning down whole areas and picking through the barbecue, and you get to spear snipe all the animals that it attracts. And if you watch my video on fire myths from all around the world, it hasn't got a lot of views, so I can use your help on that, but I covered the Aboriginals, and like almost every other culture, birds have fire and are the means by which humans get to wield it. Whether it's the Zeus and Prometheus dynamic, similar framework in Native American stories, or in the land down under, originally the seven sisters had it and they didn't want to share. Crow takes it, but then doesn't want to share it with humans, but Bunjil the eagle, and to our credit, humanity's own loud screaming and yelling at the crow, but Bunjil the eagle pushes that we should have it, and to our own credit, it was humanity's own loud screaming and yelling at the crow that finally startles him so that he drops it and it falls into our possession. And we can wield fire ever since. That video was inspired by a research paper studying birds of prey in Australia, which they've dubbed firehawks, because after natural fires, often caused by lightning, these birds will swoop in and take burning sticks and then drop them into the brush to create even more fires. They just wait till it burns through, and then they pick through the dead bodies. In that video, I posited that different cultures seeing this could be why the core of this fire-stealing myth is all over the world. That we could have seen birds using fire before we created fire. We could have gotten one of these fire sticks and just kept it going before we learned how to make friction fires on our own. But the idea of getting it from this god of the sky, these great birds, comes with a lot of moralizing on whether or not this was good or bad. Most agree that even if it's a good thing for humanity, it's absurdly dangerous, and now gives humans a lot more responsibility. Imagine to the elders' reaction to the first younger generations trying to do these controlled burns like the hawks. You can't imagine they got it right the first time, and now they end up burning down the ancestral lands, and when all of our ancestors all across the world seem to have an idea that the land itself is infused with gods and the spirits of ancestors, you using this stolen fire to burn down the land has to be the worst thing ever. But of course, all across the world, once we get this ability, we never give it up. And early European settlers often remark that much of Australia looked like parkland. It was clear of dense scrub, not realizing that this was the result of millennia of Aboriginal burning practices. In some regions, they also tried what could be called proto-agriculture, like certain yam patches or grain fields were periodically harvested and resown. And so it's just strange that that never took off. And in parts of southeastern Australia, people built complex fish traps, like the famous Brewarina stonewares. This was used to catch eels and fish, and even practiced a form of aquaculture by moving fish between ponds. And then their other tech, it is pretty simple but effective. They made stone tools like flaked scrapers, knives, hand axes, and wooden tools in the form of spears, clubs, boomerangs, digging sticks, and fiber crafts like nets, baskets, and skin cloaks. The famous boomerang, that curved throwing stick, is probably their most iconic invention. And it's actually not all, but certain types are aerodynamic, the ones that return to the thrower. And these were used for hunting birds. But they have heavy boomerangs which are for hunting larger game. It's really just their term for a big stick. They do have the spear thrower, the woomera, which acts like a lever to propel spears at greater velocity.
The spur goes into that socket, and then by lining the thing up like this, holding the woomera in the right hand, positioning the spear like that.
It's the same idea as an atlatl. And if you're wondering why they don't have the bow and arrow, that's actually a really interesting mystery. The oldest evidence of the bow and arrow is from South Africa around 64,000 years ago, and then around 48,000 years ago in Sri Lanka, and 30,000 years ago in Europe. But since the Australians leave just around that earliest time, even if there was some overlap, it doesn't seem to have been as culturally widespread at that time. But that still doesn't answer why they never eventually develop it on their own. So I tend to agree with some researchers that it just wasn't as advantageous. There's no selection pressure for it. In other words, the terrain and game being hunted was so different in Australia, and that bows are best for ambush settings, like in jungles or forests, and is more precise for smaller game, But for the more common, medium-sized game in Australia, the woomera was fine. But of course, bows are also good for getting fish, seen even with the Adamese people today. This is probably what the san looked like 65,000 years ago, as the earliest evidence of the bow we have comes from a coastal settlement in South Africa. So why wouldn't the ones on the coast of Australia have developed bows over all this time? I guess the answer is just obviously they didn't need it. Their nets were fine, but you would think having as many options as possible would always be better. And obviously the populations all around the world were doing well enough to procreate, and so it doesn't mean that tech only develops because you're facing an extinction event. If anything, if you get to that point, it's too late. The innovation would have to come at a time of surplus. You're just messing around with ideas and something works. But I dove even further into this, and they aren't the only people to not develop bows. Think about how you really don't think of Pacific Islanders using bows, even though they are living on the sea. Why aren't they fishing like the San or Adamese people? But it could just be that they mastered fishing by other means, like with poles and nets. And of course, we today don't think of a bow as being used to hunt fish. To me, that seems near impossible. But then one of the most strange cases is in Patagonia, with the Yamana and Selknam people, who just use spears and bolas, two balls with a string meant to trip animals. When you look at their terrain, some parts do just look like open areas, similar to Australia, but then you just see they have tons of forest areas. So the main point here is just you shouldn't take some tech or cultural aspect for granted. Progress is not inevitable. Sometimes things just don't happen, and nobody can actually give you a good reason why. As for their instruments, in northern Australia, the didgeridoo, that droning sound wind instrument, which is made from hollowed wood, has been played for at least 1,500 years, and it's used in songs and dances. And although it's seen as synonymous with Aboriginal people, traditionally it was only used in the Arnhem Land area, not all over Australia. It's just a funny thing how people conflate different cultures in this weird, I would describe as a sort of infantilizing, where we think that because some aspects are so ancient, that also means there's nothing new. The didgeridoo is a very simple instrument, could have been crafted 40,000 years ago, but it seems to pop up around 500 AD, and they did not have metalworking or pottery, though they of course had mastery over the resources they did use. They were known to detoxify poisonous plants, could extract water from roots in the desert, and track animals with uncanny precision. Some groups in more resource-rich areas built fairly permanent villages, like those along the Murray River, or the Torres Strait Islanders who did grow things, while others were highly mobile, seasonally moving between coast and inland, much like what we saw with the San people. In all cases, there was a deep connection to what's called country, which in Aboriginal English refers to one's ancestral land. Country is not just about the physical material in the land, but the history and spirits tied to it.
I can hear wind speaking to me. I can hear birds speaking to me. It's ancestors talking to me. All the spirits. Wherever we go, they're here.
In the rainforest of northeast Queensland lives short-statured rainforest Aboriginal people, sometimes called Ngaraban, or Australian pygmies. They had these unique dome-shaped shelters and diets of toxic nuts, which they had to carefully prepare. Along the coast, many were expert fishermen, navigating outrigger canoes and harvesting abundant seafood, and in central deserts, tribes like the Pitjant Jatjara, or Arrernte tracked between waterholes, following songlines that ensured they found food and water at the right times. In the cold Tasmanian highlands, the Tasmanian Aboriginals adapted to cold conditions, and what's really interesting is that after being isolated on their island for 10,000 years, with the rise in sea level after the Ice Age, when they get cut off, their toolkit becomes simpler. They stopped making boomerangs or fishing gear, and maybe it's just because large game and shellfish were sufficient. Though even they retain the same spiritual reverence for the land. In the modern era, the Aboriginals have faced dramatic changes, especially since the late 18th century with European colonization. For tens of millennia, they had lived with minimal external contact. There were some Makasan fishermen coming from Indonesia, which began visiting northern Australia's coast in the 1600s, and they're collecting sea cucumber. And they actually established trade relations with local Yolngu people. But the arrival of the British in 1788, the First Fleet at Sydney, marked the start of an unprecedented disruption. The British declared the land terra nullius, or land belonging to no one, and what followed would be a collapse of indigenous populations due to disease, dispossession, and war. Introduced diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles to which Aboriginal people had no immunity, this was by far the most deadly, sweeping through and decimating communities. It's estimated that in 1788 there were between 300,000 to over 1 million Aboriginal people, but within a century, those numbers fell by 80% or more in many areas. The death toll by disease was compounded by frontier violence, as the settlers were seizing large amounts of lands for farms and sheep. The sheer numbers and more advanced tech, especially in the form of firearms, led to the Aboriginals becoming quickly overwhelmed, and the survivors were pushed into marginal lands and mission stations. Sacred sites were desecrated, ancient food sources were destroyed, and the languages were suppressed. Colonial authorities and missionaries enforced policies to civilize the Aboriginal people, essentially just trying to make them English. And this culminated in the notorious stolen generations in the 20th century. Between 1910 and 1970, thousands of Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families on the orders of government agencies and raised in institutions or white foster homes, all in an effort to erase their culture and integrate them into English society. In 1967, a national referendum was overwhelmingly voted to amend Australia's constitution to include Aboriginal people in the census and allow for federal governments to make laws for them. Over the following decades, the land rights movement fought for the return of traditional lands, and in 1992, the High Court's Mabo decision overturned terra nullius and recognized the concept of native title, acknowledging that Indigenous Australians had prior rights to land if they maintained connection, though proving this ended up being very difficult in court. After all this time, saying, okay, you can go back to your ancestral land isn't as simple as it sounds, when Aboriginal is just the foreign term for all these different people groups across Australia. It'd be like in America, you're telling an Algonquin on the East Coast that, I don't know, here's your ancestral land in Southern California. You tell them they can go to some native settlement, but it's not of their tribe, it's on the other side of the continent. Culturally, most of the world has come to appreciate and try and preserve just how unique their culture is. And there are efforts to try and preserve some of their languages, but the English conquering of Australia will probably go down in history as being similar to that ancient one, the Pamayungan expansions, as it's believed that many smaller languages have gone extinct and many more are endangered. Today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which were the indigenous Melanesian inhabitants of the Torres Strait Islands between Australia and New Guinea. Combined, they represent about 3.8% of Australia's population, about 1 million people in 2021, and that's up from 3% a decade earlier. Many do live in urban areas, but there are a good number that reside in remote communities where traditional practices are a part of daily life. Many are still passing on the dreaming stories, even to fully urbanized families in Sydney or Perth, who feel that they seamlessly live in these two worlds, again poetically beautiful that it's literally true, like their view that the gods and ancestors' presence is still here today in every moment of the now because their actions in the past influence the now, and so we still interact with them. We interact with our physical and spiritual world, while now these modern Aboriginals are dealing with the modern world and their traditional world at the same time, all of which will be recorded in new songlines and part of the dream time, from describing their current lives in downtown Sydney in one long connected chain to 60,000 years ago. With that, let's end the story. I plan to do a whole bunch of smaller videos on little things touched on throughout this video, so subscribe if you don't want to miss those. Please hit that like button, it really does help out. And I'll see you in the next one.